the northeastern corner of Blackwater Cemetery, where the ancient oak trees cast their longest shadows and the ground grows soft with perpetual dampness, 5 headstones stand in perfect alignment. Each bears the surname Ellison, carved in elegant Victorian script. Each marks a date of birth, followed by a single year, 1923, 1924, 1925, 1926, 1927. But these are not graves in any conventional sense. These stones mark absences rather than remains, questions rather than conclusions. The discovery of these memorials came during routine cemetery maintenance in the autumn of 2019, when groundskeepers noticed the peculiar arrangement beneath decades of overgrown ivy. Local historians initially dismissed them as curiosities, perhaps symbolic markers for family members lost in distant wars or tragic accidents. Yet the dates troubled those who looked closer. 5 consecutive years. October 13th, inscribed on each stone. The same day, year after year, marking not deaths, but disappearances. The pattern emerged slowly, as patterns often do in stories that resist easy telling. In the basement archives of the Blackwater Historical Society, among ledgers that smell of age and neglect, the fragments began to align. Police reports filed but never resolved. Newspaper articles that began with bold headlines but ended in ellipses. Personal effects catalogued but never claimed. Each document whispered the same impossible truth. Between 1923 and 1927, 5 young women vanished from the same family, each disappearing exactly 1 year after the last, each on the 13th day of October. Catherine Ellison, age 24, October 13th, 1923. Elizabeth Ellison, age 22, October 13th, 1924. Sarah Ellison, age 19, October 13th, 1925. Mary Ellison, age 16, October 13th, 1926. Agnes Ellison, age 16, October 13th, 1927. The chronology reads like a countdown, each name Mar, king another step toward some unthinkable conclusion. The official records, such as they remain, speak in the careful language of bureaucratic uncertainty. Subject last seen, no evidence of foul play. Investigation ongoing. Yet between these clinical phrases, something else emerges, a collective reluctance to pursue certain questions, as if the community itself had agreed that some mysteries were better left undisturbed. The investigating officers' reports grow progressively shorter with each case, their language increasingly vague, until the final disappearance merits only a brief notation. Agnes Ellison reported missing, circumstances similar to previous incidents, case suspended pending new evidence. New evidence that never came. What emerges from these fragmentary records is not merely the story of 5 missing women, but a testament to the human capacity for willful forgetting. In a town where families trace their lineages back to colonial settlements, where every scandal and tragedy became part of the collective memory, the Ellison sisters exist as shadows, present in official documents, but absent from local history, acknowledged in legal records, but erased from community narrative. The weight of this erasure speaks to something deeper than mere administrative oversight. In the marginalia of police reports, in the careful omissions of newspaper coverage, in the persistent gap where the Ellison story should reside in local folklore, we find evidence of a different kind of conspiracy, not one of active suppression but of collective discomfort with questions that have no comfortable answers. Standing among those 5 empty graves, one cannot escape the profound unsettling nature of their arrangement. They face the forest that borders the cemetery's eastern edge, their granite surfaces worn smooth by decades of weather, yet still bearing traces of their careful inscription. Fresh flowers appear there occasionally, though no one claims responsibility for their placement. White jasmine usually, despite the fact that jasmine should not bloom in New England's harsh autumns. The questions multiply like shadows at twilight. How does an entire family disappear in sequence? Why has their story remained buried for nearly a century? And perhaps most troubling of all, what kind of truth could be so disturbing that an entire community would choose to forget it rather than face its implications? To understand the disappearances, we must first understand the family they consumed. The Ellison name carried weight in Blackwater during the early decades of the 20th century, the kind of respectability that money and careful social positioning could purchase. Thomas Ellison had arrived in the region in 1887, an ambitious young man with sufficient capital to purchase the failing Blackwater paper mill and the vision to transform it into one of New England's most profitable enterprises. The mill's success allowed Thomas to commission what would become known as the Ellison House, a sprawling Gothic revival mansion that dominated the hill overlooking the town center. Built of local granite and imported slate, the house embodied the Victorian fascination with architectural intimidation. Towers pierced the skyline at odd angles, bay windows jutted from unexpected corners, and an elaborate network of gabled roofs created shadows that shifted throughout the day in patterns that seemed to follow no natural law. Yet the house's most notable feature lay hidden within its walls. Thomas Ellison, perhaps influenced by the spiritualist movements of his era, had commissioned an intricate system of passages connecting the mansion's various rooms. These corridors, barely wide enough for a single person, snaked through the structure's interior walls, creating a secondary geography accessible only to those who knew its secrets. Local craftsmen spoke in whispers of the project's peculiar specifications: doors that opened onto emptiness, staircases that climbed to nowhere, rooms with no visible entrance or exit. The family that inhabited this labyrinthine structure reflected its architectural contradictions. Thomas Ellison presented himself as a pillar of community stability, attending church regularly, contributing generously to local charities, and maintaining the mill as a cornerstone of regional prosperity. Yet those who worked closely with him described a man increasingly consumed by obsessions that defied rational explanation. He spent long hours in his private study, surrounded by genealogical charts that traced family lineages back centuries, searching for patterns that others could not perceive. His wife, Margaret, had been a Boston socialite before their marriage, a woman of education and refinement who brought cultured sensibilities to Blackwater's remote social landscape. Under her influence, the Ellison House became a center of intellectual activity, hosting reading societies and cultural gatherings that attracted visitors from distant cities. Yet something in the house's atmosphere seemed to gradually erode her natural vivacity. Guests noted how she would pause mid-conversation, listening to sounds others could not hear, or how she would arrange flowers in patterns that served no decorative purpose but followed some private logic of placement and meaning. The children born to this union inherited both privilege and something less definable, a quality that set them apart from their contemporaries in ways that transcended mere social standing. Catherine, the eldest, possessed an intelligence that made her seem older than her years, a gravity that impressed adults but left her isolated among peers. Elizabeth demonstrated an artistic sensitivity so acute that her paintings captured not just visual reality, but emotional undercurrents that others failed to notice. Sarah showed scholarly inclinations that led her to spend hours in the town library, researching subjects that ranged from local history to theoretical mathematics. The youngest children, twins Mary and Agnes, shared a bond that exceeded normal sibling connection. They spoke in synchronized patterns, finished each other's thoughts, and demonstrated an uncanny ability to know each other's whereabouts without communication. Townspeople attributed this to typical twin behavior, yet those who observed them closely noted something more profound, a merger of consciousness that suggested they experienced the world as a single entity divided between two bodies. Thomas Ellison's sudden death in 1921 transformed the family's already unusual dynamics into something approaching the inexplicable. Found in his study on a February morning, surrounded by genealogical charts covered in his own handwriting, he appeared to have died of natural causes despite his relative youth and apparent good health. The coroner's report noted no signs of violence or disease, yet the manner of his death troubled those who discovered him. He sat upright in his chair, pen still in hand, having apparently died while writing. The final entry in his journal, written in increasingly erratic script, consisted of a single phrase repeated dozens of times: "The arrangement must be maintained." Margaret's response to widowhood revealed depths of character that her previous social persona had concealed. Rather than seeking comfort in community support or religious consolation, she withdrew into the house's interior spaces, spending increasing amounts of time in the hidden passages that her husband had commissioned. The servants reported hearing her voice echoing through the walls at all hours, apparently conducting conversations with invisible companions. She dismissed the household staff gradually, claiming financial constraints, until only the immediate family remained in the mansion's 37 rooms. The 5 daughters adapted to their changed circumstances in ways that reflected their individual natures while revealing their collective inheritance of something that transcended normal family dynamics. They moved through the house like figures in a carefully choreographed dance, each occupying specific spaces at predictable times, following routines that seemed to serve purposes beyond mere daily necessity. Visitors, on the rare occasions when they were admitted, described an atmosphere of perpetual anticipation, as if the family were waiting for some significant event whose nature they could not articulate. The isolation that followed Thomas Ellison's death might have been expected to diminish the family's social prominence, yet the opposite occurred. The daughters' absence from community activities seemed to increase rather than decrease their presence in local consciousness. People spoke of glimpsing them at twilight, walking in formation along the forest paths. Shopkeepers reported receiving orders written in elegant script but delivered by unknown messengers. The mill continued to operate efficiently despite the family's apparent withdrawal from its management, as if the enterprise had achieved a momentum independent of human oversight. October 13, 1923, began with weather that defied seasonal expectations. Instead of autumn's typical chill, the morning air carried an almost spring-like warmth, heavy with moisture that seemed to cling to everything it touched. In the Ellison house, Catherine woke before dawn, as had become her habit since assuming the role of family matriarch following her father's death. The servants who remained described her morning routine with the precision of ritual. Tea prepared in her mother's finest china, correspondence reviewed and answered in script that mirrored her father's elegant hand, household accounts balanced with mathematical precision that revealed both her intelligence and her burden. What distinguished this particular morning was Catherine's demeanor, a quality that the housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell, later described to police as purposeful tranquility, rather than the subtle tension that had characterized Catherine's bearing since her father's death. She moved through her morning activities with the serenity of someone who had finally resolved a complex problem. She dressed with unusual care, selecting a white dress of fine wool that she had never worn publicly, and arranged her hair in an elaborate style that required significant time and attention. The harvest celebration that evening represented one of Blackwater's most anticipated annual events, a community gathering that drew families from throughout the region to celebrate the completion of another agricultural cycle. Catherine had committed to attending weeks earlier, despite her family's increasing social withdrawal, recognizing her responsibility to maintain certain public appearances on behalf of the Ellison name. Her sisters had declined to accompany her, claiming various obligations, leaving Catherine to fulfill this social duty alone. Mrs. Hartwell's testimony, preserved in the police files, provides your most detailed account of Catherine's final hours in the house. She found Catherine in the library during the late afternoon, not reading but sitting in perfect stillness before the window that overlooked the town. When asked about her plans for the evening, Catherine responded with uncharacteristic specificity. She would leave the house at sunset, walk the familiar path to town, attend the celebration long enough to acknowledge the appropriate people, and return home before midnight. She spoke, Mrs. Hartwell recalled, as if she were describing events that had already occurred, rather than plans she intended to execute. Catherine's bedroom, when examined after her disappearance, revealed preparations that suggested both departure and permanence. Her clothes were arranged with museum-like precision, each garment folded and placed according to some organizing principle that remained unclear to investigators. Personal items were positioned on her dressing table in patterns that seemed deliberate, yet served no obvious practical purpose. Most puzzling was the condition of her bed, made with such meticulous care that it appeared almost ceremonial, as if prepared for some significant visitor who would never arrive. She left the house at 7:17 p.m., according to Mrs. Hartwell's precise recollection. The housekeeper watched from the kitchen window as Catherine walked down the gravel drive, her white dress luminous in the gathering darkness. The path to town followed a route that Catherine had traveled hundreds of times, through the estate's wooded grounds, past the old mill pond, and along the country road that led directly to Blackwater's center. The entire journey should have required 45 minutes at most. Catherine never arrived at the harvest celebration. The first expressions of concern came from David Morrison, a local merchant who had specifically arranged to meet Catherine at the event. When she failed to appear by 8:30, he inquired among other attendees, assuming she had been delayed by family obligations. By 9 o'clock, several community members had noted her absence, unusual given her explicit commitment to attend. By 10 o'clock, a small group had formed to discuss whether someone should check on the Ellison family. Mrs. Hartwell received their inquiry at 10:45 p.m. Catherine had not returned home. She had not sent word of any change in plans. The path between the house and town showed no evidence of her passage, no disturbed vegetation, no dropped personal items, no indication that she had ever begun the journey she had described with such certainty hours earlier. The initial search began that night and continued for 3 days. Local men familiar with the terrain explored every possible route between the Ellison estate and the town center. They expanded their search to include the surrounding forest, the mill pond, and even the abandoned buildings that dotted the rural landscape. They found nothing. No trace of Catherine's white dress, no sign of struggle or accident, no evidence that she had existed anywhere in the physical world after walking down her family's driveway. The police investigation, led by Sheriff Malcolm Crane, followed the methodical procedures appropriate for a missing person case. They interviewed family members, household staff, and community members who might have encountered Catherine during her journey. They examined the physical evidence with the thoroughness that serious crimes demanded. Their findings, documented in reports that still exist in the county archives, present a catalog of impossibilities. Catherine's footprints in the gravel drive ended abruptly 50 yards from the house, despite the soft earth that should have recorded her passage for the entire quarter-mile distance to the main road. The white dress she wore was unique enough that any witness should have remembered seeing it, yet no one along her intended route reported any such encounter. Most troubling was the discovery, 3 days after her disappearance, of a single white glove, unmistakably Catherine's, placed with deliberate care on a stone bench in the town square, precisely where she should have arrived for the harvest celebration. The glove's placement suggested not accident, but intention, not loss, but message. It had been positioned with the same meticulous care that characterized Catherine's bedroom arrangements, folded and placed in a manner that served no practical purpose but conveyed a disturbing sense of ritual completion. Around the bench, despite the absence of jasmine plants anywhere in the vicinity, hung the faint but unmistakable scent of jasmine blossoms. Sheriff Crane's final report, filed 6 weeks after Catherine's disappearance, concluded with careful bureaucratic language that concealed more than it revealed. No evidence of foul play discovered. Subject's whereabouts remain unknown. Investigation suspended pending discovery of additional evidence or witnesses. Yet the margins of his handwritten notes tell a different story, revealing his private speculation about phenomena that could not be incorporated into official documentation. Footprints end as if she simply ceased to exist. No one vanishes without leaving some trace. Something about this case defies normal explanation. The community's response to Catherine's disappearance established patterns that would repeat with each subsequent loss. Initial shock gave way to determined search efforts, which yielded to uncomfortable speculation, which finally settled into a kind of collective amnesia. People spoke of Catherine in past tense within weeks of her disappearance, as if accepting her death despite the absence of any evidence to support such a conclusion. The harvest celebration the following year proceeded without acknowledgement of the previous year's disruption, as if the community had agreed that some events were better forgotten than examined too closely. Yet the forgetting was incomplete. In the months following Catherine's disappearance, residents reported encounters that suggested her presence in places where she could not logically exist. A figure in white glimpsed at the forest's edge during twilight hours. A woman's voice calling from empty houses. The persistent scent of jasmine in locations where no flowers bloomed. These reports were dismissed as manifestations of grief and guilt, yet their frequency and consistency suggested something more systematic than mere imagination. The year between Catherine's disappearance and Elizabeth's vanishing transformed the Ellison household from a place of mourning into something approaching the supernatural. Margaret Ellison's response to her eldest daughter's loss revealed depths of character that her previous social persona had successfully concealed. Rather than seeking comfort in community support or religious consolation, she retreated into the house's hidden passages, conducting what the remaining servants described as conversations with invisible participants. Elizabeth, thrust into the role of family spokesperson despite her artistic temperament, struggled to maintain the facade of normalcy that social expectations demanded. Her paintings during this period, several of which survive in private collections, reveal a profound shift in both subject matter and technique. Where her earlier works had captured the natural beauty of the local landscape with impressionistic sensitivity, her new paintings depicted interiors, rooms within rooms, corridors that seemed to extend beyond the canvas's boundaries, shadows that suggested human presence without revealing human forms. The most disturbing of these works, titled The Arrangement in Elizabeth's careful script, shows what appears to be a family gathering in an elegant parlor. 5 female figures sit in formal poses, their faces obscured by the painting's deliberately dim lighting. What makes the image unsettling is not what it shows, but what it suggests. The figures seem positioned not for comfort, but according to some ceremonial protocol, and their postures convey not relaxation, but anticipation, as if they are waiting for some significant event to commence. Sarah, the family's scholar, responded to Catherine's loss by intensifying her research into subjects that ranged from local history to genealogical documentation. Her frequent presence at the town library, previously attributed to intellectual curiosity, took on a more urgent quality. Librarian Miss Eleanor Walsh noted that Sarah's requests became increasingly specific and unusual. Property deeds dating back to the colonial period, census records that traced family lineages across generations, and particularly disturbing, obituaries and missing person reports that covered the previous century. She seemed to be searching for patterns, Miss Walsh later told investigators, not just information but connections between pieces of information that others might not perceive as related. The twins, Mary and Agnes, responded to their family's crisis by deepening their already unusual bond. Neighbors reported seeing them walking together at all hours, often in weather that should have kept sensible people indoors, following paths through the forest that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. Their movements had acquired a quality that transcended normal sibling cooperation. They walked in perfect synchronization, turned their heads simultaneously, and spoke in alternating phrases that created single coherent thoughts expressed through 2 voices. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper who remained loyal to the family despite increasingly uncomfortable circumstances, provided investigators with detailed observations of the household's changing dynamics. The house itself seemed to respond to Catherine's absence in ways that defied rational explanation. Doors that had remained locked since Thomas Ellison's death began opening spontaneously. Footsteps echoed through corridors where no one walked. The scent of jasmine, which had appeared briefly after Catherine's disappearance, now permeated the house constantly, strongest in the rooms that Catherine had most frequently occupied. It felt, Mrs. Hartwell explained, as if the house were trying to maintain some kind of balance that Catherine's absence had disrupted. October 13, 1924, began with weather that mirrored the previous year's unseasonable warmth. Elizabeth spent the morning in the conservatory that served as her painting studio, working on what would be her final canvas. Unlike her recent interior scenes, this painting depicted the view from her studio window, the gardens, the forest beyond, and the sky above. Yet something in her technique transformed this apparently natural scene into something deeply unsettling. The shadows fell in directions that defied the light's actual angle. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating a sense of enclosure rather than openness. Most disturbing was the sky, rendered in shades that suggested neither day nor night but some temporal condition that existed between the two. Elizabeth's routine that day followed patterns that had become established since Catherine's disappearance. She painted until midday, then took her lunch in the garden despite the approaching autumn weather. She spent the afternoon reviewing correspondence that required responses, maintaining the social connections that family reputation demanded. As evening approached, she prepared for what appeared to be an ordinary evening at home. She changed into comfortable clothes, arranged her art supplies for the next day's work, and settled into the library with a book she had been reading for several weeks. Mrs. Hartwell served dinner at the usual time, noting nothing unusual in Elizabeth's demeanor or conversation. The family ate together, as had become their custom, though the conversation consisted mainly of practical matters, household arrangements, business correspondence, plans for the coming week. Elizabeth mentioned her intention to complete the painting she had begun that morning, expressing satisfaction with its progress and anticipating its completion within a few days. At 8:30, Elizabeth excused herself to return to her painting. The conservatory where she worked was a glass-enclosed addition to the house's original structure, designed to capture maximum natural light during the day while providing an intimate space for evening activities. The room's transparency made it visible from several other locations within the house, allowing family members to observe each other's activities without intrusion. This architectural feature, intended to promote family connection, would provide the most bewildering aspect of Elizabeth's disappearance. Sarah, reading in the adjacent library, could see directly into the conservatory through its interior windows. Agnes and Mary, completing their evening walk, passed by the exterior windows at approximately 9 o'clock and observed Elizabeth at her easel, painting by lamplight with her characteristic focused intensity. Mrs. Hartwell, collecting the dinner service, glanced through the conservatory door at 9:15 and saw Elizabeth step back from her canvas, apparently to evaluate her progress. At 9:30, Sarah noticed that the conservatory had become unusually quiet. Elizabeth's painting sessions typically involved subtle sounds, the soft brush strokes against canvas, the gentle clink of palette knife against palette, the occasional shift of position around the easel. The absence of these familiar sounds prompted Sarah to look more carefully at the conservatory. Elizabeth was not visible at her usual position, though her lamp continued to burn and her painting supplies remained arranged on the work table. Assuming that Elizabeth had stepped away briefly, perhaps to gather additional materials or rest her eyes, Sarah returned to her reading. 15 minutes later, the continued silence prompted another glance. The conservatory remained unchanged, lamp burning, supplies arranged, canvas positioned on its easel, but Elizabeth was nowhere to be seen. The room's glass walls made concealment impossible. Every corner was visible from multiple angles, every possible hiding place exposed to observation. Sarah's investigation of the conservatory revealed the same impossible circumstances that had characterized Catherine's disappearance. Elizabeth's painting, left uncompleted on the easel, showed clear evidence of recent work: wet paint on the palette, fresh brush strokes on the canvas that had not been present during the afternoon. Her shawl hung over the back of her chair, as if she had just removed it. A cup of tea, still warm, sat beside her painting supplies. Everything suggested her recent presence, yet she was simply not there. The search for Elizabeth followed the same methodical procedures that had been employed for Catherine, with the same ultimately fruitless results. The conservatory's glass construction eliminated the possibility of hidden exits or concealed passages. The doors to the room had remained under observation throughout the evening. The windows, while large enough to permit passage, were positioned 15 feet above the ground with no adjacent structures that could facilitate entry or exit. Most significantly, the glass showed no signs of disturbance, no smudges that might indicate someone pressing against it, no scratches that might suggest forced entry or exit. Elizabeth's final painting, left incomplete on her easel, provided the investigation's most puzzling evidence. The canvas showed the garden scene she had described to Mrs. Hartwell, painted with her characteristic skill and attention to detail, yet something in the work's execution created an overwhelming sense of unease among those who viewed it. The shadows seemed to move when observed from different angles. The sky's color shifted subtly depending on the lighting conditions in the conservatory. Most disturbing was the gradual realization that the painting depicted not the garden as it appeared that day, but the garden at night, illuminated by moonlight that revealed details impossible to observe in darkness. Sheriff Crane's investigation of Elizabeth's disappearance proceeded with greater thoroughness than the previous year's inquiry, yet yielded equally inexplicable results. The physical evidence defied rational explanation. The timing and circumstances eliminated conventional possibilities. The family's cooperation was complete, yet their accounts of the evening's events raised more questions than they answered. His final report, filed 6 weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance, used language that barely concealed his professional frustration. Investigation has revealed no evidence of criminal activity or accidental harm. Subject's whereabouts remain unknown despite exhaustive inquiry into all reasonable possibilities. The community's response to the second disappearance revealed the psychological patterns that would define their reaction to subsequent losses. Initial concern gave way to uncomfortable speculation about the family's possible involvement in their own misfortunes. Some suggested that the Ellison women were staging their disappearances for reasons that remained unclear. Others proposed that family money was being used to relocate the missing daughters to distant locations where they could begin new lives under different identities. These theories, while providing psychological comfort to those who needed rational explanations, failed to account for the physical impossibilities that characterized each case. More disturbing were the reports that began to accumulate in the months following Elizabeth's disappearance. Residents claimed to see her walking along forest paths at twilight, always at the periphery of vision, always just far enough away to make positive identification impossible. Her figure was reportedly glimpsed in the windows of empty houses, in reflections that appeared in storefront glass, in shadows that moved independently of the objects that should have cast them. These sightings were dismissed as manifestations of collective anxiety, yet their consistency and frequency suggested something more systematic than mere imagination. The discovery that would ultimately provide the most intimate glimpse into the Ellison family's final months came not during the initial investigations but decades later, during the mansion's demolition in 1962. Workers removing interior walls found a cache of letters sealed within a hollow space between the first and second floors, a hiding place that could only have been accessed through the house's network of hidden passages. These documents, written in the identical handwriting that only twins could share, consisted of correspondence addressed to their vanished sisters. The letters, preserved now in the county historical archives, reveal a household gripped by ritualistic behavior and supernatural dread. They provide evidence of phenomena that the official investigations could never have documented, described in the matter-of-fact tone that only those who have adapted to impossibility can achieve. Reading them today, one confronts not just the testimony of witnesses to inexplicable events, but the gradual psychological transformation of young women who found themselves living within the boundaries of a reality that operated according to rules they could not understand but had learned to navigate. Mary and Agnes wrote to Catherine and Elizabeth as if their sisters remained present but unreachable, describing daily events and family activities with the assumption that their correspondence would somehow be received and read. The earliest letters, dated shortly after Catherine's disappearance, maintained the conventional tone of family communication. Reports of household activities, local news, reassurances about their mother's health and their own well-being. Yet even these initial documents contain references to phenomena that suggest the writers were adapting to circumstances that exceeded normal family crisis. "Catherine, we found your gloves arranged on the dressing table again this morning," reads one early letter. "Mother says the drafts in the house are responsible for moving things about, but we know you are trying to tell us something. We have begun to pay attention to these arrangements, looking for patterns that might explain what you need us to understand." As the correspondence continues through the months following Elizabeth's disappearance, the twins' tone shifts from confused grief to determined comprehension. They describe shared dreams that provided them with information they could not have acquired through normal means. They report conversations with their missing sisters, heard through the house's walls during the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. Most significantly, they document their mother's increasingly desperate attempts to protect them from whatever force had claimed their siblings. "Elizabeth came to us in the conservatory last night," Agnes writes in a letter dated March 15, 1925. "She could not speak in the way she used to, but she showed us how to read the shadows that the lamplight creates on the wall. The shadows tell stories about the family that lived here before us, about the arrangements they made, about the price they paid for maintaining those arrangements. We understand now why Father spent so many hours studying the genealogical charts. We understand why Mother spends her time in the hidden passages. The house requires certain things from the families who live within it, and our sisters are helping us learn what those requirements involve." The twins' letters reveal their mother's efforts to break what she had come to believe was a generational curse. Margaret Ellison consulted spiritualists from distant cities, inviting them to the house for seances that never produced the communication she desperately sought. She researched the house's previous occupants, discovering a pattern of unexplained disappearances that extended back to its original construction. Most disturbing, she found evidence that Thomas Ellison had been aware of this history when he purchased the property, and that his architectural modifications, particularly the network of hidden passages, had been designed to accommodate supernatural requirements rather than human convenience. Mother showed us Father's journals last night. Mary writes in a letter dated September 3, 1925. He knew about the arrangement when he built this house. He knew what would be required of the family that lived here. The passages he had constructed serve as pathways for those who have fulfilled their obligations to the house. Catherine and Elizabeth are not gone in the way that ordinary people understand absence. They have become part of the house's structure, part of the arrangement that allows it to exist as it does. Mother believes she can break this pattern by moving us away from here, but we know that would not solve the fundamental problem. The arrangement must be maintained, and we are the ones chosen to maintain it. The letters document the twins' growing acceptance of their fate, described not with terror but with something approaching relief. They had spent their entire lives sensing that they were different from other children, that their family operated according to rules that did not apply to their neighbors and classmates. The disappearances of their sisters had finally provided an explanation for the strangeness they had always perceived but never understood. They were not victims of random misfortune, but participants in a system that had operated for generations, fulfilling obligations that their father had accepted on behalf of his descendants. Agnes and I discussed our situation during our walk this morning, reads Mary's letter dated October 1, 1926. We understand that we will join Catherine and Elizabeth before this year ends. We have prepared ourselves for this transition, arranging our personal belongings in the patterns that the house seems to require, spending time in the passages where we can hear our sisters' voices most clearly. They have shown us what to expect, how to make the passage from one kind of existence to another. We are not afraid. We have always shared everything, and we will share this final experience as we have shared all the others. The twins' final letters, written during the days immediately preceding their disappearances, provide the most detailed documentation of the supernatural phenomena that had consumed their household. They describe doors that opened onto rooms that should not exist, staircases that led to locations outside the house's physical boundaries, and conversations with family members who could not be seen but whose presence could be felt with absolute certainty. They document their mother's complete psychological collapse, her inability to distinguish between past and present, living and dead, reality and the elaborate fantasy she had constructed to explain their impossible circumstances. Mother spends all her time in Father's study now, Agnes writes in her penultimate letter, dated October 11, 1927. She talks to him as if he were sitting in his chair, working on his genealogical charts. She asks him to explain the arrangement, to tell her how to save us, to release us from the obligations he accepted when he decided to build this house. But Father cannot answer her questions because he is part of the arrangement now, just as Catherine and Elizabeth have become part of it, just as Mary and I will become part of it when our time arrives. The house it's what it requires, and we have learned to accept this truth rather than fighting against it. The final letter, dated October 12, 1927, and written in alternating paragraphs by both twins, serves as both confession and prophecy. They acknowledge their understanding of what will occur, express their gratitude for the life they have shared, and provide instructions for anyone who might eventually discover their correspondence. Most chilling, they describe their preparations for the transition they expect to undergo, including the arrangement of their personal belongings according to patterns that mirror those found in their missing sisters' rooms. To whoever finds these letters, the document concludes, know that we chose to fulfill our obligations rather than attempting to escape them. The arrangement that governs this house has existed longer than our family's occupation of it, and will continue after our family's time here ends. We do not ask for understanding or sympathy, only for recognition that some mysteries cannot be solved because they are not problems to be resolved, but realities to be accepted. Tomorrow we join our sisters in whatever existence awaits those who have completed their part of the arrangement. We go willingly, united as we have always been, prepared for whatever form our continued existence will take. October 13, 1926, arrived with weather that had become characteristic of the date. Unseasonably warm air, heavy with moisture that seemed to press against the skin like silk. Mary Ellison woke before dawn, as had become her custom during the weeks leading up to this day. Her movements through the house followed patterns that she and Agnes had established through careful observation of their vanished sisters' final routines. She dressed in white wool, arranged her hair with elaborate care, and prepared tea using her mother's finest china, ritu. All that seemed to serve purposes beyond personal comfort or aesthetic choice. Agnes maintained constant companionship with her twin during these morning activities, not through conversation but through the synchronized movement that had characterized their relationship since childhood. They moved through the house's rooms like dancers following choreographed steps, each knowing without communication where the other would be at any given moment. Their behavior suggested not casual coordination, but adherence to some precise protocol that left no room for improvisation or error. Margaret Ellison had withdrawn completely from awareness of external reality by this time. She spent her days in Thomas's study, conducting animated conversations with her deceased husband, while reviewing genealogical charts that she rearranged constantly without apparent purpose. The twins cared for her with patient devotion, ensuring that she ate regular meals and maintained personal hygiene, but they no longer attempted to engage her in coherent communication about present circumstances. She existed within a temporal framework that encompassed past, present, and anticipated future as a single continuous experience. Mrs. Hartwell, the sole remaining servant, had given her notice weeks earlier, but agreed to remain until after October 13th out of concern for the family's welfare. Her presence provided the investigation with its most detailed documentation of the twins' final day together. She observed Mary and Agnes following routines that mirrored those of their vanished sisters, but with variations that suggested they were adapting established patterns to accommodate their unique circumstances as twins who expected to disappear simultaneously. The day proceeded with ceremonial precision. The twins spent the morning hours in their respective bedrooms, arranging personal belongings according to patterns that Mrs. Hartwell described as museum-like in their careful organization. They took lunch together in the garden, despite the October date, sitting at the wrought iron table where Elizabeth had often painted her outdoor subjects. Their conversation, overheard by Mrs. Hartwell, consisted of references to arrangements they had made for their mother's care after their anticipated departure, as if they were discussing travel plans rather than their own disappearance. Mary spoke of Agnes as if she were already gone, Mrs. Hartwell later testified, and Agnes referred to Mary in the same way. They discussed themselves in past tense while sitting directly across from each other, sharing their meal in perfect normalcy. As evening approached, the twins made their final preparations with the methodical attention to detail that had characterized their sister's last days. Mary retired to her bedroom at 8 o'clock, explaining to Mrs. Hartwell that she needed to complete certain arrangements before morning. Agnes positioned herself in the corridor outside Mary's door, settling into a chair she had placed there specifically for this purpose. She informed Mrs. Hartwell that she would maintain vigil throughout the night, ensuring that nothing disturbed Mary's rest. The bedroom door was locked from the inside at Mary's request. Agnes possessed the only other key, which she kept in her possession throughout the night. The room's windows, while large enough to permit passage, were positioned on the second floor, with no adjacent structures or natural features that could facilitate exit. Most significantly, Agnes never left her position in the corridor, maintaining constant observation of the door through which anyone entering or leaving the room must pass. Mrs. Hartwell checked on the twins periodically throughout the evening. At 9 o'clock, she knocked on Mary's door and received a clear response confirming that all was well. At 11 o'clock, she repeated this inquiry with the same result. Agnes remained alert and responsive throughout these interactions, confirming that she had heard no sounds from within the room that might suggest disturbance or distress. The corridor where she maintained her vigil was illuminated by electric lighting that eliminated any possibility of someone passing unobserved. At midnight, Mrs. Hartwell made her final check of the evening. Mary's response to her knock seemed fainter than before, but remained audible and coherent. Agnes reported no changes in the room's status, no sounds that might indicate unusual activity. The housekeeper retired to her own quarters at 12:30, satisfied that both twins were safely settled for the night. Agnes never left her position in the corridor. This fact would prove central to the investigation's ultimate bewilderment, as it eliminated every conventional explanation for what occurred during the early morning hours of October 14, 1926. At 6 o'clock, Mrs. Hartwell found Agnes still seated in her chair, alert and responsive, maintaining the vigil she had promised to keep. Yet when they unlocked Mary's bedroom door, the room was empty. The circumstances of Mary's disappearance replicated the physical impossibilities that had characterized her sister's vanishing while introducing new elements that further defied rational explanation. Her bed had been slept in, the covers arranged with the same ceremonial precision that had marked Catherine and Elizabeth's preparations. Her nightclothes were folded and placed on the dressing table according to patterns that seemed to follow deliberate organizational principles. Most disturbing was the discovery of a single white glove, identical to those found after Catherine's disappearance, placed with careful precision on the windowsill, despite the fact that the window remained securely locked from the inside. The scent of jasmine filled the room with such intensity that it seemed almost visible, clinging to fabrics and furniture with persistence that defied the season and the absence of any flowering plants in the vicinity. Yet beneath this familiar fragrance lay something else, a subtle alteration in the room's atmosphere that Mrs. Hartwell described as emptiness that went beyond mere absence, as if the space itself had been fundamentally changed by whatever had occurred there. Agnes's response to her twins' disappearance revealed the profound bond that had connected them throughout their lives. Rather than expressing shock or grief, she demonstrated what could only be described as completion, the satisfaction of someone who had fulfilled a complex obligation according to precise specifications. She helped Mrs. Hartwell search the empty room with methodical thoroughness, examining every surface and opening every container, yet her manner suggested someone confirming expected results rather than someone hoping to discover overlooked clues. She knew Mary was gone, Mrs. Hartwell later explained to investigators. Not gone in the way people usually disappear, but gone in the specific way that her sisters had gone. She understood something about these disappearances that the rest of us could not grasp, and Mary's absence confirmed rather than surprised her. The year between Mary's disappearance and Agnes's anticipated vanishing transformed the Ellison house into something that resembled a mausoleum more than a family residence. Margaret's grip on present reality disappeared entirely. She lived within memories that encompassed decades of family history while remaining unaware of current circumstances. Agnes cared for her mother with devoted patience while preparing for her own transition with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her sister's final preparations. Agnes spent long hours in the house's hidden passages, following routes that connected rooms in patterns that seemed to serve purposes beyond mere transportation. Mrs. Hartwell reported hearing conversations echoing through the walls, Agnes's voice alternating with responses that came from invisible speakers, discussing arrangements and obligations in language that suggested ongoing negotiation rather than simple communication. The housekeeper never attempted to follow these voices to their source, recognizing that some activities were not meant for outside observation. October 13, 1927 began with weather conditions that mirrored the previous year's unseasonable warmth. Agnes woke before dawn, as had become her established pattern, and moved through morning routines that reflected her sister's practices while accommodating her unique position as the final participant in whatever process had consumed her family. She dressed with the same careful attention to appearance that had marked Catherine, Elizabeth, and Mary's final days, selecting garments that suggested ceremonial significance rather than practical comfort. The presence of outside observers on this final October 13th reflected the community's growing unease with the pattern that had claimed 4 members of the Ellison family. Sheriff Crane had positioned deputies around the property's perimeter, while several prominent townspeople had volunteered to maintain vigil within the house itself. Their presence provided the investigation with multiple witnesses to events that would prove equally impossible to explain or deny. Agnes spent the day in activities that followed established patterns while serving as farewell gestures to the life she expected to leave behind. She walked through each room of the house, pausing in locations that held particular significance, touching objects that had belonged to her vanished family members. Her manner suggested someone conducting a final inventory rather than someone experiencing grief or fear about her anticipated fate. As evening approached, Agnes gathered the volunteer observers in the main parlor and addressed them with remarkable composure. She thanked them for their concern and their willingness to witness whatever would occur during the night. She explained that she expected to join her sisters before morning, and she requested that they document their observations with complete accuracy, regardless of how impossible those observations might appear to rational analysis. "I know that what will happen tonight will seem to defy explanation," she told the assembled witnesses. "I ask only that you record what you observe, without attempting to make it conform to your understanding of what should be possible. Some truths can only be accepted, not understood." At 8 o'clock, Agnes retired to Mary's bedroom, the same room where her twin had disappeared exactly 1 year earlier. She locked the door from the inside, as Mary had done, and confirmed through the door that she was settling in for the night. The volunteer observers positioned themselves in the corridor outside, maintaining constant surveillance of the door while Sheriff Crane's deputies monitored the room's exterior from their positions around the house. The observations documented by these witnesses would provide the most thoroughly corroborated account of an Ellison disappearance, yet their testimony only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Throughout the evening, Agnes responded normally to periodic inquiries about her welfare. The observers heard sounds consistent with someone preparing for sleep, footsteps crossing the room, the creak of bed springs, the rustle of bedclothes being arranged. At 11 o'clock, Agnes wished them good night through the door, her voice clear and calm. At midnight, the sounds from within the room ceased entirely. The observers continued their vigil, noting the absolute silence that replaced the subtle sounds of human occupancy. At 2 o'clock in the morning, one of the witnesses detected the scent of jasmine beginning to emanate from beneath the door. By 3 o'clock, this fragrance had become so intense that it seemed to displace the air in the corridor, creating an atmosphere that several observers described as otherworldly in its sweetness. At dawn, Sheriff Crane used his authority to override the locked door, breaking it open to reveal the room's impossible emptiness. Agnes was gone. Her nightclothes were folded and arranged on the dressing table with the same precision that had characterized her sister's disappearances. The bed showed evidence of occupancy, but appeared to have been prepared with ceremonial care after that occupancy ended. On the windowsill, positioned with deliberate precision, lay a single white glove identical to those found after previous disappearances. The investigation that followed this final vanishing proceeded with unprecedented thoroughness, yet yielded the same ultimately fruitless results that had characterized all previous inquiries. Every conventional explanation was eliminated by the physical evidence and witness testimony. Every possible means of exit was eliminated by the constant observation maintained throughout the night. The case files document a methodical exploration of every rational possibility, followed by the grudging acknowledgement that rational possibilities had been exhausted without providing viable explanations. Sheriff Crane's final report, filed 8 weeks after Agnes's disappearance, marked the official conclusion of the Ellison investigation. His language revealed the professional frustration of a man required to document events that challenged every assumption about reality's fundamental nature. After exhaustive investigation employing all available resources and expertise, this office has been unable to determine the circumstances surrounding the disappearances of the 5 Ellison daughters. The physical evidence defies conventional explanation. The witness testimony eliminates all known possibilities for voluntary departure or criminal involvement. The cases remain officially open, yet no further investigative avenues appear viable given current resources and knowledge. The Ellison house stood empty for 35 years following Agnes's disappearance, a Gothic monument to questions that no one seemed willing to ask. Margaret Ellison, her grip on reality completely severed by the loss of all 5 daughters, was quietly moved to a private sanitarium where she lived in careful seclusion until her death in 1943. The estate, with no direct heirs and no buyers willing to purchase property associated with such disturbing history, gradually fell into the kind of decay that transforms grand architecture into something resembling a haunted attraction. Yet the house's emptiness did not eliminate the phenomena that had plagued its final occupants. Local residents reported lights moving through the windows during the darkest hours of night, despite the absence of electrical service to the abandoned structure. Children walking home from school claimed to see figures in white dresses standing at the upper story windows, always at the periphery of vision, always gone when observed directly. Most persistently, the scent of jasmine continued to emanate from the property during the autumn months, strongest around October 13th of each year. The first attempt to occupy the house after the Ellison family's disappearance came in 1962, when developer Harold Mitchell purchased the property with plans to demolish the existing structure and construct a modern residential subdivision. His work crews discovered the twins' hidden letters during the demolition process, but this revelation came only after they had experienced their own encounters with the house's inexplicable nature. Workers reported tools moving from their designated locations overnight, always arranged in patterns that seemed deliberately organized rather than randomly disturbed. Construction equipment malfunctioned in ways that defied mechanical explanation, engines that stopped without mechanical failure, electrical systems that failed despite proper installation and adequate power supply. Most disturbing were the workers' accounts of voices echoing through the structure during demolition activities. These sounds, described as female voices engaged in conversation, seemed to come from sections of the house that had already been torn down. The conversations were conducted in language too distant to understand clearly, yet their tone suggested ongoing discussion of important matters rather than random vocalization. Work crews began refusing assignments that required them to remain on the property after sunset, citing an atmosphere that made concentration and normal work activities impossible. Mitchell's demolition project was abandoned after 6 weeks, following an incident that none of the workers were willing to describe in detail to local authorities. The developer's insurance claim, filed shortly after his withdrawal from the project, mentioned unforeseen structural complications and hazardous atmospheric conditions, but provided no specific explanation for the substantial financial losses he absorbed by terminating the contract. The property reverted to municipal ownership, where it remained as an undeveloped lot that seemed to resist all attempts at utilization. Subsequent efforts to make productive use of the Ellison property encountered similar difficulties. In 1978, the town council approved plans for a small public park that would incorporate the site into Blackwater's recreational facilities. Landscaping crews planted trees and installed walkways according to conventional design principles, yet their work seemed to modify itself overnight. Trees planted in straight lines appeared in curved arrangements by morning. Walkways laid in geometric patterns developed organic curves that followed no planned design. Most puzzling, the jasmine plants that no one had ordered or planted began appearing throughout the park area, thriving in soil and climate conditions that should not have supported their growth. The park project was quietly abandoned after maintenance crews reported their inability to keep the landscaping in its intended configuration. Visitors to the incomplete park described an atmosphere of profound unease, particularly during the evening hours when shadows began to lengthen across the grounds. Children refused to play in the area, claiming that they heard voices calling their names from locations where no people could be seen. Adults found themselves reluctant to remain on the property for extended periods, experiencing what they described as a persistent feeling of being observed by invisible watchers. Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, a professor of paranormal psychology at a nearby university, conducted the most systematic investigation of the Ellison property during the 1980s. Her research team employed electromagnetic field detectors, temperature monitoring equipment, and audio recording devices in an attempt to document the phenomena that had been reported by numerous witnesses over the decades. Their findings, published in the Journal of Anomalous Research, provided scientific validation for claims that had previously been dismissed as folklore or imagination. The electromagnetic readings revealed patterns of activity that corresponded to no known natural or artificial sources. Temperature variations occurred in localized areas without identifiable causes, creating zones of unusual warmth that persisted despite ambient weather conditions. Most significantly, the audio equipment recorded voices speaking in conversational tones during periods when no human beings were present on the property. Analysis of these recordings revealed multiple female speakers discussing subjects that ranged from domestic arrangements to abstract philosophical concepts. The voices demonstrate clear intelligence and purposeful communication, Dr. Hawthorne noted in her published findings. They respond to changes in environmental conditions and appear to acknowledge the presence of our monitoring equipment. Whatever consciousness generates these vocalizations possesses awareness of current circumstances rather than simply repeating historical patterns. Her research team's most remarkable discovery came during their investigation of the property's electromagnetic anomalies. The readings revealed a complex pattern of energy fluctuations that seemed to follow architectural blueprints, as if the original house's structure continued to exist in some form, despite its physical demolition decades early. The energy patterns corresponded precisely to the building's original floor plan, including the network of hidden passages that Thomas Ellison had commissioned during the structure's initial construction. "We are documenting evidence that suggests the house continues to exist in some non-physical form," Dr. Hawthorne explained in a follow-up interview. "The energy signatures we have recorded match the building's original configuration with remarkable precision. It appears that whatever consciousness inhabits this property has maintained the architectural framework that served as its original focus of activity." Local residents' experiences with the former Ellison property have continued to accumulate over the decades, creating a body of anecdotal evidence that supports Dr. Hawthorne's scientific observations. Dog walkers report their animals refusing to cross the property boundaries, displaying signs of distress when brought near the area. Joggers who use the surrounding paths describe sudden temperature changes and the persistent scent of jasmine during their evening runs. Most commonly, people driving past the property at night claim to see lights moving through the trees in patterns that suggest human activity, despite the absence of any physical structures to house such activity. The phenomenon reaches its peak intensity each year during the second week of October, culminating on October 13th, the anniversary date that marked each of the original disappearances. During this period, the reports of unusual activity increased dramatically in both frequency and intensity. Multiple witnesses have described seeing figures in white dresses moving through the property at twilight, always maintaining distances that prevent clear identification, yet displaying behavior patterns that suggest purposeful activity rather than random manifestation. Perhaps most intriguing are the accounts provided by individuals who claim direct communication with the consciousness that inhabits the former Ellison property. These witnesses, typically people who possess what they describe as psychic sensitivity, report conversations with entities that identify themselves as the vanished Ellison daughters. The communications, conducted through various methods ranging from automatic writing to direct telepathic contact, consistently describe a form of existence that transcends conventional understanding of life and death. They explain that they have not died in any traditional sense, relates Maria Santos, a local medium who has conducted multiple sessions at the site. Instead, they have transitioned to a different kind of existence that allows them to maintain their family connections while fulfilling obligations that were established long before their births. They describe their current state as a form of service rather than punishment, and they express satisfaction with their role in maintaining what they call the arrangement. These communications have provided details about the house's history that extend far beyond the Ellison family's brief occupation. According to these sources, the property has served as a focal point for supernatural activity since the colonial period, requiring periodic sacrifices from the families who attempt to inhabit it. The architectural modifications that Thomas Ellison commissioned were designed to accommodate and channel these supernatural requirements, creating a structure that could house both human occupants and the non-physical consciousness that claimed the property as its domain. The house was never truly demolished, the communications explain. Its physical structure was removed, but its essential nature remains intact. The passages that connected the rooms continue to exist, though they now connect spaces that exist outside normal physical reality. The family that lived there last understood their obligations and fulfilled them willingly, becoming permanent residents in the house's non-physical dimensions. Standing in Blackwater Cemetery on the October evening as shadows lengthen across the weathered headstones, one confronts the profound inadequacy of conventional explanation when faced with mystery that transcends rational boundaries. The 5 empty graves that mark the Ellison Sisters' disappearances serve not as monuments to tragedy, but as acknowledgments of questions that resist all attempts at resolution. Their granite surfaces, worn smooth by decades of New England weather, bear witness to the limits of human understanding when confronted with phenomena that operate according to rules we cannot perceive or comprehend. The investigation into the Ellison disappearances, exhaustive though it was, ultimately revealed more about the boundaries of knowledge than about the events it sought to explain. Police reports documented physical impossibilities with bureaucratic precision. Witness testimony eliminated conventional explanations while raising questions that exceeded the scope of criminal investigation. Scientific inquiry provided evidence of anomalous phenomena while failing to offer theoretical frameworks adequate to encompass such evidence. Each attempt to solve the mystery generated additional mysteries, creating an expanding web of inexplicable circumstances that seemed to mock human confidence in rational analysis. Yet perhaps the true significance of the Ellison story lies not in what it reveals about supernatural phenomena, but in what it demonstrates about the human relationship with uncertainty. The community's response to the disappearances, the initial shock giving way to determined investigation, followed by uncomfortable speculation, and finally settling into collective amnesia, illustrates our species' profound discomfort with questions that cannot be answered through familiar methodologies. We prefer mysteries that yield to persistent inquiry, problems that reward diligent analysis with satisfying solutions. The 5 Ellison sisters vanished into a realm that exists beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience, yet their disappearance continues to exert influence within the world they left behind. Their story has become part of Blackwater's hidden history, whispered among residents who understand that some subjects are discussed only in private conversations, acknowledged only through indirect reference. The official silence that surrounds their case reflects not conspiracy or cover-up, but the community's intuitive recognition that certain truths cannot be integrated into conventional social discourse without fundamentally altering the assumptions that make normal life possible. Modern visitors to the former Ellison property often report experiences that suggest the sisters' influence extends far beyond their original temporal boundaries. The jasmine that blooms out of season, the voices that echo through autumn evenings, the lights that move through darkness where no light should exist, these phenomena continue to manifest with consistency that defies dismissal as imagination or folklore. They represent evidence of consciousness that has transcended the limitations of physical existence while maintaining connection to the location that served as the focal point for the higher transformation. Dr. Hawthorne's research established scientific credibility for claims that skeptics had previously dismissed, yet her findings raised more questions than they answered. The energy patterns that correspond to the demolished house's architectural structure suggest that physical demolition cannot eliminate whatever forces claim the Ellison family. The recorded voices that demonstrate awareness of current circumstances indicate consciousness that continues to develop and respond rather than merely repeating historical patterns. Most significantly, her documentation of electromagnetic anomalies that follow precise architectural blueprints implies the existence of reality dimensions that operate according to physical laws we do not yet comprehend. The communications reported by psychically sensitive individuals provide the most detailed descriptions of the sisters' current existence, yet these accounts challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of life, death, and individual identity. According to these sources, the Ellison daughters have not ceased to exist, but have transitioned to a form of being that allows them to fulfill obligations that preceded their births, while maintaining the family bonds that define their earthly relationships. They describe their role not as punishment for unknown transgressions, but as service that contributes to the maintenance of cosmic arrangements that extend far beyond human understanding. We are not trapped. These communications consistently emphasize, we are fulfilling our purpose in ways that transcend the limitations we experience during our physical existence. The house provided a gateway to responsibilities that our family had inherited across generations, and we accepted those responsibilities willingly, rather than attempting to escape them through flight or denial. Our current existence allows us to serve functions that are necessary for the proper operation of realities that extend beyond the physical dimension where most human consciousness remains focused. These descriptions challenge conventional understanding of individual autonomy and free will, suggesting that human beings may be bound by obligations that extend across generations and transcend the boundaries of single lifetimes. The Ellison sisters' acceptance of their fate implies recognition of cosmic principles that operate independently of human desires or preferences, requiring participation in arrangements that serve purposes beyond individual happiness or fulfillment. Yet their story also demonstrates the possibility of finding meaning and satisfaction within circumstances that would seem to represent absolute loss from conventional perspectives. The communications describe their current existence not as imprisonment, but as liberation from the constraints that limited their earthly experience. They express gratitude for the opportunity to serve functions that contribute to universal harmony, while maintaining eternal connection with the family members who shared their transformation. The broader implications of the Ellison case extend far beyond the boundaries of paranormal investigation or historical curiosity. Their disappearances provide evidence that reality includes dimensions and principles that remain largely invisible to ordinary human perception, yet continue to influence events within the physical world where most human activity occurs. The consistency of supernatural phenomena associated with their former property suggests that these non-physical dimensions operate according to discoverable laws rather than random supernatural chaos. Most profoundly, the Ellison story challenges our culture's fundamental assumptions about individual identity and autonomous existence. Their willingness to fulfill inherited obligations rather than asserting independent desires suggests alternative approaches to human purpose that emphasize service to transcendent principles rather than pursuit of personal satisfaction. Their apparent contentment within circumstances that would seem to represent ultimate tragedy implies possibilities for meaning and fulfillment that extend beyond conventional understanding of human flourishing. Standing among those 5 empty graves as twilight deepens into darkness, one cannot escape the recognition that some questions are not meant to be answered, but to be lived within. The Ellison sisters disappeared into mystery, yet their story continues to illuminate the profound unknowability that surrounds human existence. Their empty headstones mark not conclusions, but beginnings, invitations to consider possibilities that exceed the boundaries of familiar experience, acknowledgments that reality includes dimensions we have barely begun to explore. The jasmine that blooms impossibly in October's chill, the voices that echo through autumn evenings, the lights that move through darkness where no physical source exists. These phenomena serve as reminders that the world contains vastly more than our theories can encompass or our instruments can measure. The Ellison sisters vanished into that vastness, yet their disappearance continues to generate evidence that consciousness itself may be far more expansive and resilient than our materialist assumptions would suggest. Their story endures not because it provides answers, but because it poses questions that transform our understanding of what questions are worth asking. In seeking to comprehend their fate, we encounter the boundaries of comprehension itself. In attempting to solve the mystery of their disappearance, we discover that some mysteries serve functions that transcend solution, offering instead opportunities for recognition of the profound depths that underlie surface appearances. The 5 empty graves stand in perfect alignment, facing the forest where shadows gather each evening to create patterns that suggest presence without revealing form. They mark the resting place not of bodies but of certainties, not of lives but of assumptions, not of individuals but of the comforting illusion that human existence operates within boundaries we can map and navigate with confidence. The Ellison sisters stepped beyond those boundaries into territory that remains largely unmapped, yet their footsteps continue to echo across the years, calling to those who possess the courage to acknowledge that mystery itself may be the most profound truth we can ever hope to encounter. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps recognition of the unknowable represents the highest form of knowledge, acceptance of mystery, the deepest form of understanding. The Ellison sisters vanished into questions that have no answers, yet their disappearance continues to generate insights that no amount of conventional investigation could provide. They became part of the arrangement that governs realities we cannot see, fulfilling obligations we cannot comprehend, serving purposes that extend beyond the boundaries of individual existence. Their story reminds us that some truths can only be approached through surrender rather than conquest, accepted rather than solved, lived within rather than explained away. In learning to dwell comfortably within such mysteries, we may discover forms of knowledge that transcend the limitations of rational analysis, forms of understanding that embrace, rather than eliminate the profound uncertainties that define the human condition. The weight of silence that surrounds the Ellison case speaks not to absence, but to presence. The presence of realities that exceed our current capacity for comprehension. The presence of consciousness that transcends the boundaries of individual identity. The presence of purposes that extend beyond the limits of single lifetimes. In that silence, if we listen carefully, we may hear echoes of truths that our familiar categories cannot contain, intimations of possibilities that our conventional assumptions cannot accommodate. And perhaps in the end, that is precisely what the Ellison sisters intended to leave behind. Not answers, but better questions. Not solutions, but deeper mysteries. Not conclusions, but invitations to explore territories of experience that remain largely unmapped by human consciousness. Their disappearance marks not an ending, but a beginning, not a closure, but an opening, not a tragedy, but a transformation that continues to unfold across the years in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew about the nature of existence itself.